In 1976, George Lucas was filming Star Wars, and he had a problem. Okay, George Lucas always had problems when making the original Star Wars trilogy, but that's beside the point. This problem had the makings of a catastrophe, the kind that could destroy his filmmaking career. Filming had already started, and Sir Alec Guinness was threatening to quit the production. There would be no time or money to recast Obi-Wan and reshoot his scenes. Star Wars would effectively be finished. But the worst part was the reason Sir Alec Guinness was threatening to quit altogether. It was all in response to a different, deeper problem that George was desperately trying to fix. Hey filmmakers, welcome to the Filmmaking Notebook, where I teach you filmmaking one scene, shot, and character at a time. If we haven't met yet, welcome. My name is Ryan, and today we're talking filmmaking lore, one of my absolute favorite things in the world to chat about. But even more importantly, we're going to discuss a vitally important lesson from the making of Star Wars that everyone who's pursuing creative projects, whether that's film or something else, needs to hear, so that you don't regret it like I did. But we'll get to that. George Lucas had just finished the first block of filming, a horrible shoot in the desert of Tunisia, where storms destroyed sets, props broke, and equipment malfunctioned. Things were supposed to improve when the crew moved to contained studio work in England, but George had been plagued by a problem with the script. A problem that involved the highest paid actor on the production, the only true movie star who brought possibly the only sense of legitimacy to the film that nobody except George Lucas really understood. And Alec Guinness was an actor who really didn't like it when his characters died. And that's where everything went wrong, as midway through the shoot, George Lucas had to tell Sir Alec Guinness that he'd suddenly decided to kill him off. Because in the original script, the script that they had been shooting with up until this point, Obi-Wan Kenobi survived the film. But that was all about to change. When Sir Alec Guinness heard the news that he was to be killed off, he went apoplectic and threatened to quit this ridiculous film with the rubbish dialogue that he didn't understand. Star Wars would be destroyed before it was even half filmed. George Lucas had one chance to convince Sir Alec Guinness to stay and let Obi-Wan be killed off. But to understand why George Lucas was making this drastic story change mid-production at the risk of losing his only movie star, we need to understand the deep story problem George realized he had. In the current version of the script, Luke Skywalker and company sneak aboard the Death Star, pull off a dramatic rescue heist, fight some bad guys, confront the Dark Lord, and effectively escape without a scratch. It was a really fun Act 2 sequence, but structurally, it had a deep story problem. It stripped the Empire of power and made the Dark Forces little more than bumbling idiots. If a random band of heroes who have just met can whisk in and out of the technological terror of the galaxy, the question inherently becomes, how much danger is the Rebel Alliance really in? We've effectively lowered the stakes to the point where the danger is no longer realistic. And when you lower the stakes, the tension starts to drop, and that is where you lose the audience. So as George worked through the first few weeks of filming, he was starting to realize that his story was going to collapse right as it entered the third act. And this is why this is important. In story structure terms, you'll often hear this moment called the darkest night of the soul, or the journey to the inmost cave, something along those lines. There's different terminology based on different screenwriting teachers. But it's that moment where the hero reaches his lowest point and has to do everything he can to summon up the strength and courage and spirit to keep on going to the end. It's the moment that signals the end of Act 2 and the beginning of Act 3, where the whole story begins to come together and ramp up to the inevitable climax. But without a scene like this, where something drastic happens and the hero crashes to a low, low point, the audience will be left without tension, without stakes, and without a good reason to be truly, deeply engaged. Without that deeply low moment where hope is at its very lowest, you just don't have the emotional stakes to carry the film to the end. But to make matters even worse, the script George Lucas was shooting, once they reached the Rebel base on Yavin 4, Obi-Wan had pretty much nothing to do for the rest of the film. He'd become nothing more but baggage and exposition at that point, doing little more but explaining how to destroy the Death Star, watching the battle helplessly, and then helping hand out some medals. It was actually George's wife, Marcia Lucas, who made the suggestion that would change Star Wars forever. And at first, George really didn't like it, but Marcia, who happened to win an Oscar for editing Star Wars, I must add, argued that multiple story problems would be solved if Obi-Wan Kenobi died on the Death Star. And, most importantly, the entire film would get infinitely better. But there was another problem. Filming had already started, as we mentioned, and Sir Alec Guinness didn't really want to be there in the first place. He called the dialogue rubbish and he didn't understand the story. And we have to remember, the original Star Wars was filmed during an age when movie stars very often got exactly what they wanted. And if they didn't like something, well, that could spell certain doom to a production. To George's credit though, he broke the news to Sir Alec Guinness himself, rather than making his producer have the tough conversation, which would have been emotionally easier for him, but he did the thing he should do and went and talked to him himself. But it was there that George made a nearly fatal mistake. After pulling Guinness aside to explain his character's new fate, he got cold feet and told Sir Alec that actually, he hadn't entirely made up his mind yet. This lack of commitment from George made Guinness angrier than actually being killed off, and reported that he was irritated by Lucas saying that he hadn't made up his mind whether to kill off my part or not. Sorry, I'm not trying to do an Alec Guinness impersonation. I'm not going to try that. But Lucas immediately realized his mistake, and then he needed to make a quick decision. But the damage was done, and Sir Alec Guinness threatened to walk away from the film altogether. The production was already behind schedule. If Sir Alec Guinness walked, there would be no time or money for recasting or reshoots. Star Wars would have simply died, unfinished. So, knowing that his film and his future were at stake, Lucas took Alec Guinness out to lunch to make one last-ditch effort to save his story. But this time, he did it from a new angle. He explained to Guinness that after the Death Star escape, you do nothing. Effectively, he just stood around, gave the odd bit of exposition, and handed out those medals we just mentioned. There was nothing dramatic about it, and certainly had no impact on the story. Alec Guinness took in George's words carefully and professionally, but after lunch, he called his agent and screamed his head off, or so the story goes. And it probably did happen that way. But he also realized that Lucas had pointed out something important. No actor likes to stand around in scenes with nothing to do. George had offered him a way for the character to deeply impact the story, and as a bonus, had eliminated a bunch of days from his shooting schedule where he would have had nothing to do but just stand around. So, despite his grumblings and earlier misgivings, Guinness reluctantly decided to trust George Lucas and stayed committed to the film. But there's something even more revealing in George Lucas's response to Alec Guinness that really shows why Star Wars ended up working when everyone said it would flop. During that lunch meeting, George ultimately told Guinness, "Look, all I care about is what's best for the movie. I'm also trying to spare your character some difficult moments coming up." It's that first part that reveals why George Lucas succeeded while the vast majority of filmmakers fail. And it also explains why Alec Guinness eventually decided to trust George Lucas. Lucas knew that Star Wars had problems, and while he couldn't fix all the broken droids or make all the effect shots look exactly how he envisioned them in his head, there was one vital thing he could control: the story. And this is where most filmmakers make the wrong choice. Everyone and everything, from film studios to film schools to even just plain old conventional logic, will say that once production begins, you stick with the plan, and you film the plan, and you don't deviate from the plan. And yes, there is definitely some wisdom to that, but when the default decision is always the plan, that nearly always leads to mediocre and completely forgettable films. George Lucas risked his film because he understood this: once I made up my mind, other things start to fall into place. That's the fun part of filmmaking. When you find something that doesn't work, you look at it and you figure a way around. Find a better answer, and it will work. It works on a lot of different levels you'd never even thought of. But the risk here is that for the director who wants to do what's best for the story, it's almost always a brutal battle trying to convince others, studios, producers, even colleagues like your fellow actors, that you know what you're doing and that you're not acting on a whim or making an emotional decision, but that the change will only make the movie better. And there's an even deeper factor that most people don't want to talk about. It takes a lot of humility to set aside your pride and be willing to take an honest look at your film and say, you know what, this isn't working. I'm going to do the hard, painful, creative thing and do whatever it takes to make it better, even if I'm the only one willing to do so. And if you're an aspiring filmmaker, this is the uncomfortable truth that you're so much better off hearing now. And I have two stories from my own filmmaking journey to show you what I mean. But first, if this is your first time here and you're learning something about filmmaking, I'd love for you to comment filmmaker below. And if you're feeling super bold, let me know if there are any particular movies, characters, scenes, any of it that you want covered in a future filmmaking video. Okay, so years ago, I was working on an indie film set, the kind of low budget production where I was given some freedom to speak my mind when I saw problems, and I clearly remember this rift between the director and the producer. There were some parts of the story that just weren't clicking, and one in particular that was actually a major plot hole. And the producer and director argued about restructuring a small part of the story to make the rest of the film work. But like George Lucas, production had already started, and this would require creating a brand new scene. A scene that wasn't originally part of the plan. I distinctly remember encouraging the director to go for it, but he wouldn't unless he had buy-in from the producer, and sadly, eventually, the plan won out. The film was released with confusing, unresolved story elements and became instantly forgettable, sadly. Talking about problems is never enough. It requires something else. But before we get to that, I promise this next part is not me trying to say that I'm better than other filmmakers. I've made more filmmaking mistakes than I care to admit and a lot that I'm embarrassed about. This is simply the other half of the lesson that I'm sharing with the hopes of encouraging you, the next generation of filmmakers, or even just someone who loves watching movies and wants to get a better understanding of how these things are made and why sometimes there's so much potential that is clearly obvious on the cinema screen, but just doesn't execute. This is for you too. Nearly 20 years ago, I was directing my first independent feature film, and things were going horribly awful. The shots were bland, the edit was boring, and the story was basically inherently broken. But I already had a release date that was coming up in a matter of weeks. Now, full disclosure, this is an important fact. This was a stupidly low budget film that I was basically paying for myself out of my poor pocket. But because I was paying for it, I had the control to shift the release date and kind of do what I wanted. But I knew that in order to fundamentally fix the film, I need another year. A year of rewrites and reshoots and literally throwing out half of what I'd already filmed and effectively starting over, except for the few scenes that could be saved by massive re-edits. It was a horrible feeling, and part of me just wanted to throw the whole thing in the trash. But I knew that if I gave up, I would never stop regretting it. So I took a couple of months to re-edit the salvageable bits, rewrite the rest, and basically start it over. A year later, the finished film premiered to a standing ovation. It remains the creative project I'm most proud of, and not only because of the outcome, because it showed me how to work harder on a film, on a story than I thought was possible. And it taught me that any story problem is solvable. But the only reason that happened was because I was willing to throw away the plan and do what was best for the story. And granted, doing what's best for the story doesn't always work out exactly how you envision it. Sometimes there are budget and location and schedule restraints and other factors that will force you to get creative in how you solve your story problems. But making your best attempt to do what's best for the story is always worth it. It actually reminds me of a story from another film where there was a major problem that the director had to creatively fix in a way that ultimately made the story's most important scene work abundantly better than the plan. But we'll explore that in the next video, which should be ready in a week or two. And ironically, that wasn't even supposed to be the next video. I literally just right now decided that the plan for this channel is better served if I tell you that filmmaking story next instead of what I had originally planned. Sometimes you just know. But I'll post that video here when it's live, and until next time, get offline and go create something epic.